Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are continuing in The Birth of Tragedy. We are up to section 16, and with that said, I'll get started. Let's now imagine that one great cyclops eye of Socrates focused on tragedy, that eye in which the beautiful madness of artistic enthusiasm never glowed. Let's imagine how it was impossible for that eye to peer into the Dionysian abyss with a feeling of pleasure. Then what must that eye have been in the, quote, lofty and highly praised, in quote, tragic art, as Plato calls it? Something really unreasonable, with causes without effects, actions which apparently had no causes, and as a whole so varied and with so many different elements that any reasonable person had to reject it, but dangerous tinder for sensitive and easily excitable minds. We know which single form of poetry Socrates understood, Aesop's fables. And no doubt his reaction involved that smiling complacency with which the noble and good Gellert in his fable of the bee and the hen sings the praises of poetry. You see in me the use of poetry, to tell the man without much sense, a picture image of the truth of things. But for Socrates, tragic art did not seem, quote, to speak the truth, end quote, at all, apart from the fact that it did address itself to those without much sense, and thus not to philosophers, a double excuse to keep one's distance from it. Like Plato, he assigned it to the art of cosmetics, which present only a pleasant surface, not the useful, and he therefore demanded that his disciples abstain and stay away from such unphilosophical temptations, with so much success that the young poet of tragedy, Plato, immediately burned his poetical writing in order to be able to become Socrates' student. But where invincible talents fought against the Socratic instructions, his power, together with the force of his immense personality, was always still strong enough to force poetry itself into new attitudes, unknown up until then. An example of this is Plato himself. To be sure, in his condemnation of tragedy and art in general, he did not remain back behind the naive cynicism of his master. But completely from artistic necessity, he had to create an art form related directly to the existing art forms which he had rejected. The major criticism which Plato made about the old art, that it was the imitation of an illusion and thus belonged to a lower level than the empirical world, must above all not be directed against his new work of art. And so we see Plato exerting himself to go beyond reality and to present the idea which forms basis of that pseudo-reality. With that, however, the thinker Plato reached by a detour the very place where, as a poet, he had always been at home, and where Sophocles and all the old art was protesting against Plato's criticism. If tragedy had assimilated all earlier forms of art, so the same holds true, in an odd way, for Plato's dialogues, which were created from a mixture of all available styles and forms, and hover between explanation, lyric, drama, prose, and poetry, right in the middle, and so doing broke through the strict old law about the unity of stylistic form. The Cynic philosophers went even further along the same path, with their excessively garish and motley collection of styles, weaving back and forth between prose and metrical forms. They produced the literary image of raving Socrates, which they were in the habit of presenting in their own lives. The Platonic dialogue was, so to speak, the boat on which the shipwreck of the old poetry, along with all its children, was saved. Pushed together into a single narrow space with an anxious Socrates at the helm, they humbly set off now into a new world, which never could see enough fantastic images of this event. Plato really gave all latter worlds the image of a new form of art, the image of the novel, which can be characterized as an infinitely intensified Aesopian fable, in which the relative priorities of poetry and dialectical philosophy were the same as the relative priorities of that very philosophy and theology for many hundreds of years. Poetry, in other words, was subservient. This was poetry's new position, the place into which Plato forced it under the influence of the daemonic Socrates. Now, philosophical ideas grew up around art and forced it to cling to the trunk of dialectic. Apollonian tendencies metamorphosed into logical systematizing, something corresponding to what we noticed with Euripides, as well as a translation of the Dionysian into naturalistic effects. Socrates, the dialectical hero in Platonic drama, reminds us of the changed nature of the Euripidean hero, who has to defend his actions with reasons and counter-reasons, and thus frequently runs the risk of losing our tragic sympathy. For who can fail to recognize the optimistic element in the heart of dialectic, which celebrates a jubilee with every conclusion, and can breathe only in a cool conscious brightness, that optimistic element, which, once pushed into tragedy, gradually overruns its Dionysian regions, and necessarily drives them to self-destruction, right to their death leap into middle-class drama. Let people merely recall the consequences of the Socratic sayings, "Virtue is knowledge. Sin arises only from ignorance. The virtuous person is the happy person." In these three basic forms of optimism lies the death of tragedy. For now the virtuous hero must be a dialectician. Now there must be a perceptible link between virtue and knowledge, belief and morality. Now the transcendental vision of justice and Aeschylus is lowered to the flat and impertinent principle of poetical justice, with its customary deus ex machina. What does this new Socratic optimistic stage world look like with respect to the chorus and the whole musical Dionysian basis for tragedy in general? All that seemed to be something accidental, a reminder of the origin of tragedy which we can well do without, because we have come to realize that the chorus can be understood only as the origin of tragedy, and the tragic in general. Already in Sophocles, the chorus reveals itself as something of an embarrassment, an important indication that even with him the Dionysian stage of tragedy was beginning to fall apart. He did not dare to trust the chorus, to carry the major share of the action, but limited its role to such an extent that it appears almost as one of the actors, just as if it had been lifted out of the orchestra into the scene. This feature naturally destroys its nature completely, no matter how much Aristotle approved of this arrangement of the chorus. This demotion in the position of the chorus, which Sophocles certainly recommended in his dramatic practice, and according to tradition, even in a written text, is the first step towards the destruction of the chorus, whose phase is in Euripides, Agathon, and the New Comedy, followed with the breakneck speed one after the other. Optimistic dialectic, with its syllogistic whip, drove music out of tragedy. That is, it destroyed the essence of tragedy, which can be interpreted only as a manifestation and imaginary presentation of Dionysian states, as a perceptible symbolizing of music, as the dream world of a Dionysian intoxication. We have noticed that an anti-Dionysian tendency already effective before Socrates, which only achieves in him an expression of incredible brilliance. Now we must not shrink back from the question of where such a phenomenon as Socrates points, for we are not in a position, given the Platonic dialogues, to see that phenomenon as a force of totally negative dissolution. And so, while it's true that the immediate effect of the Socratic drive was to bring about the destruction of Dionysian tragedy, the profound living experiences of Socrates himself force us to the question whether or not there must necessarily be only an antithetical relationship between Socrates' doctrines and art, and whether the birth of an artistic Socrates is in general something of a contradiction. Where culture is concerned, that despotic logician now and then had the feelings of a gap, an emptiness, a partial sense of reproach for a duty he might have neglected. As he explains to his friends in prison, often one and the same dream apparition came to him, always with the words, "Socrates, practice music." He calmed himself right up to his last days with the interpretation that his philosophizing was the highest musical art, and believed that it was incorrect that a divinity would remind him of common popular music. Finally, in prison, he came to understand how, in order to relieve his conscience completely, to practice that music which he had considered insignificant. And in this mood he composed a poem to Apollo, and rendered a few of Aesop's fable in verse. What drove him to this practice was something like of the voice of his warning daemon. It was his Apollonian insight, that, like a barbarian king, he did not understand a divine image, and was in danger of sinning against a divinity through his failure to understand. That statement of Socrates' dream vision is the single indication of his thinking about something perhaps beyond the borders of his logical nature. So he had to ask himself, have I always labeled unintelligible things I could not understand? Perhaps there is a kingdom of wisdom which is forbidden to the logician. Perhaps art is even a necessary correlative and supplement to scientific understanding. Section 15. In the sense of this last ominous question, we must now discuss how the influence of Socrates has spread out over later worlds, right up to the present, and even into all future ages, like a constantly growing shadow in the evening sun, and how that influence always makes necessary the recreation of art. I mean art in its most profound and widest metaphysical sense, and through its own immortality guarantees the immortality of art. For this fact to be acknowledged, before it was established that all art inherently depended on the Greeks, from Homer right up to Socrates, we had to deal with these Greeks as the Athenian dealt with Socrates. Almost every age and cultural stage has at some time or another sought an ill-tempered frame of mind to free itself of the Greeks, because in comparison with the Greeks, all their achievements, apparently fully original and admired in all sincerity, suddenly appeared to lose their color and life, and were reduced to unsuccessful copies, even caricatures. And so a heartfelt inner anger constantly kept breaking out against that arrogant little nation which dared throughout time to define everything that was not produced in its own country as barbaric. Who were these Greeks, people asked themselves, who had achieved only an ephemeral historical glitter, only ridiculously restricted institutions, only an ambiguous competence and morality, who could even be identified with hateful vices, yet who had nevertheless taken a preeminent place among nations for their value and special importance, something fitted for a genius among the masses. Unfortunately, people were not lucky enough to find the cup of hemlock which can do away with such a being, for all the poisons they created, envy, slander, and inner anger, were insufficient to destroy that self-satisfied magnificence. Hence, confronted by the Greeks, people have been ashamed and afraid. It seems that an individual who values the truth above everything else might dare to propose as true the notion that the Greeks drive the chariot of our culture and every other one, but that almost always the wagon and the horses are inferior material and cannot match the glory of their drivers, who then consider it funny to whip such a team into the abyss, over which they themselves jump with a leap worthy of Achilles. To demonstrate that Socrates also merits such a place among the drivers of the chariot, it is sufficient to recognize him as typifying a form of existence inconceivable before him, the type known as theoretical man. Our next task is to reach some insight about the meaning and purpose of such a man. The theoretical man, like the artist, takes an infinite satisfaction in the present, and is, like the artist, protected by that satisfaction from the practical effects of pessimism, with its lynx eyes, which glow on only in darkness. But while the artist, in his revelation of the truth, always keeps his enchanted gaze hanging on what still remains hidden after his revelation, theoretical man enjoys and remains satisfied with the covers which have been thrown off, and takes his greatest delight in the process of continually successful unveiling, a success which his own power has brought about. There would be no scientific knowledge if it concerned itself only with that one naked goddess, and had nothing else to do. For then its disciples would have to feel like those people who want to dig a hole straight through the earth, and one among them sees that, even with the greatest lifelong effort, he is in a position to dig through only a really small piece of the immense depths, and that piece will be covered over in front of his very eyes by the work of the person next to him, so that a third person would apparently do as well to select a new place for the tunneling effort he undertakes on his own initiative. Now, if one person convincingly demonstrates that it is impossible to reach the Antipodes by this direct route, who will want to continue to work on in the old depths, unless there was a possibility in the meantime that he would be happy finding some valuable rock or discovering some natural law? For that reason, Lessing, the most noble theoretical man, dared to state that for him the search for the truth counted for more than truth itself. That statement unmasks the fundamental secret of scientific knowledge, to the astonishment, even the anger of scientists. Now, of course, alongside this single recognition, excessively truthful and brave, stands a profound but delusive image, which first came into the world in the person of Socrates, that unshakable faith, that thinking, guided by the idea of causality, might reach into the deepest abyss of being, and that thinking is capable of not just understanding being, but even correcting it. This lofty metaphysical delusion is inherent in scientific research, and leads it over and over again to its limits, at which point it must turn itself into art, something which is really predictable in this mechanical process. With the torch of this idea, let's look at Socrates. To us, he appears as the first person who was capable not only of living under the guidance of this scientific instinct, but also of dying under it, something much more difficult. Therefore, the picture of the dying Socrates as a man raised above fear and death by knowledge and reason is the emblazoned shield hanging over the entranceway to scientific research, reminding every individual of his purpose, namely, to make existence intelligible, and thus apparently justified. Of course, when reasoning cannot succeed in this endeavor, myth must finally serve, something which I have just noted as the necessary consequence, indeed even the purpose of science. Anyone who clearly sees how, after Socrates, that mystagogue of knowledge, one philosophical school after another, like wave after wave, arose in turn, and how an unimaginable universal greed for knowledge through the full extent of the educated world steered knowledge around on the high seas as the essential task for every person of greater capabilities, a greed which it has been impossible since then to completely expel from scientific knowledge, and how through this universal greed a common net of thinking was cast over the entire earth for the first time, with even glimpses of the rule-bound workings of an entire solar system. Whoever reminds himself of all this, together with that astonishingly high pyramid of contemporary knowledge, cannot deny that in Socrates we see a turning point and vortex of so-called world history. Imagine for a moment the following scenario. If the incalculable sum of all the energy which has been used in pursuit of this world project is spent not in the service of knowledge, but on the practical, i.e. egotistical aims of individuals and peoples, then in all probability the instinctive delight in living would be so weakened in universal wars of destruction and continuing migrations of people, that with suicide being a common occurrence, the individual, perhaps out of a sense of duty, would have to see death as a final rest. And like the inhabitants of the Fiji Islands, the son would strangle his parents, the friend would strangle his friend. A practical pessimism, which could give rise to a dreadful ethic of mass murder out of sympathy, such a belief is present, and was present all over the world, wherever art did not appear in some form or other, especially in religion and science, as a remedy and a defense against that pestilence. With respect to this practical pessimism, Socrates is the original picture of the theoretical optimist, who, in the belief, which I have described, that we could discover the nature of things, conferred upon knowing and discovering the power of a universal medicine, and understood evil in itself as error. To push forward with that reasoning and to separate true knowledge from appearance and error seems to the Socratic man to be the noblest, even the single truly human vocation, just as that mechanism of ideas, judgments, and conclusion has been valued from Socrates on as the highest activity and the most admirable gift of nature, above all other faculties. Even the noblest moral deeds, the sympathetic emotions, self-sacrifice, heroism, and that calmness in the soul, so difficult to attain, which the Apollonian Greeks called sophrosine, all these were derived by Socrates and his like-minded descendants, right up to the present from dialectical knowledge, and therefore described as teachable. Whoever has experienced the delight of a Socratic discovery and feels how this, in ever-widening rings, seeks to enclose the entire world of phenomena, will experience no spur capable of pushing him into existence more intense than the desire to complete that conquest and to weave a solid, impenetrable net. To a man so minded, the Platonic Socrates appears as the teacher of an entirely new form of Greek serenity, and of a blissful existence which seeks to discharge itself in actions. And these actions will consist, for the most part, like those of a midwife, of things concerned with the education of noble disciples, in order to produce an endless supply of geniuses. But now science, as incited by its powerful delusion, speeds on inexorably right to its limits, at which point the optimism hidden in the essence of logic fails. For the circumference of the circle of science has an infinity of points, and while it is still impossible to see how that circumference could ever be completely measured, nevertheless the noble, talented man, before the middle of his life, inevitably comes up against some border point on that circumference, where he stares at something which cannot be illuminated. When at this point he sees to his horror how logic turns around on itself, and finally bites its own tail, then a new form of knowledge breaks through, the acknowledgement of the tragic, which in order merely to be endured, requires art as a protector and healer. If we look at the loftiest realms of the world streaming around us, our eyes strengthened and refreshed by the Greeks, we become aware of that greed of insatiably optimistic knowledge, which Socrates previews for us, turning into tragic resignation and a need for art, even if it's true that this same greed, in its lower levels, must express itself as hostile to art, and must especially loathe Dionysian tragic art, as I have already explained in the example of the conflict between Aeschylean tragedy and Socratic doctrine. Here we are now knocking with turbulent feelings on the door of the present and future. Will that transformation lead to continuously new configurations of genius and straight to the music, playing Socrates? Will that wide net of art, whether in the name of religion or of science, fly over existence always more tightly and delicately, or is it determined that it will be ripped to shreds by the restless barbaric impulses and hurly-burly which we now call the present? We are standing here on the sidelines as lookers-on, worried but not without hope, for we are being permitted to witness that immense struggle and transition. Ah, but there is a magic spell in these battles. Whoever looks at them must also fight them. Section 16. By setting out this historical example, we have attempted to clarify how tragedy surely dies away with the disappearance of the spirit of music, since tragedy can arise only out of this spirit. To mitigate the strangeness of this claim, and on the other hand, to indicate the origin of this idea of ours, we must now openly face up to analogous phenomena of the present time. We must stride right into the midst of those battles, which, as I have just said, are being waged in the loftiest spheres of our present world, between the insatiably optimistic desire to know and the artistic need for tragedy. In this discussion, I shall omit all the other opposing drives which have in every age worked against art, especially against tragedy, and which at present have taken hold to such an extent that, for example, in the art of the theater, only farces and ballets achieve a fairly rich profit with their fragrant blooms, which are perhaps not for everyone. I shall speak only of the most illustrious opposition to the tragic world view. By that I mean research scholarship, optimistic to the core of its being, with its father Socrates perched on the pinnacle. Shortly I shall also indicate by name the forces which seem to me to guarantee a new birth of tragedy, and who knows what other blessed hopes for the German character. Before we leap into the middle of this battle, let us wrap ourselves in the armor of the knowledge we seized upon earlier. In opposition to all those eager to derive art from a single principle as the necessary living origin of every work of art, I keep my eyes fixed on both those artistic divinities of the Greeks, Apollo and Dionysus, and recognize in them the living and clear representatives of two art worlds, very different in their deepest being and their highest goals. Apollo stands before me as the transfigured genius of the individualizing principle, through which release is only to be truly attained in illusion. However, under the mystical, joyous cries of Dionysus, the spell of the individuation shatters, and the way lies open to the maternal source of being, to the innermost core of things. This tremendous difference, which opens up a yawning gap between plastic art as Apollonian and music as Dionysian art, became more or less obvious to only one great thinker, when he, without any prompting from the symbolism of the Greek gods, recognized the different character of music and the origin of all other arts from it, because music is not, like all the other art forms, images of appearances, but an immediate reflection of the will itself, and also because it presents itself as the metaphysical counterpart to all physical things in the world, the thing in itself as counterpart to all appearances. Schopenhauer, World as Will and Idea, Volume 1, page 310. On the basis of this most significant way of understanding all aesthetics, which, taken seriously, marks the first beginning of aesthetics, Richard Wagner, to confirm its lasting truth, set his stamp, when he established in his Beethoven that music must be assessed on aesthetic principles, entirely different from those for all fine arts, and not at all according to the category of beauty, although an erroneous aesthetics, in the service of a misleading and degenerate art, has become accustomed to the idea of beauty asserting itself in the world of images, and to demand from music an effect similar to the effect of plastic arts, namely the arousal of satisfaction in beautiful forms. After my recognition of that tremendous opposition, I sense in myself a strong urge to approach the essence of Greek tragedy, and in so doing, the deepest insight into the Hellenic genius. Now, for the first time, I believed I was capable of the magical task of posing the basic problem of tragedy in my own mind, over and above the jargon of our customary aesthetics. Through that, such a strange idiosyncratic glimpse into the Hellenic was granted to me, that it had to appear to me as if our classical Hellenistic scholarship, which is so proud of itself, had up to this point known, for the most part, only how to gloat over games with shadows and trivialities. We may be able perhaps to touch on this original problem with the following question. What aesthetic effect arises when those separate powers of art, the Apollonian and the Dionysian, come to operate alongside each other? Or, put more briefly, what is the relationship between music and images and ideas? Richard Wagner applauded Schopenhauer on this very point for the restrained clarity and perceptiveness of his explanation. Schopenhauer spoke his views on this matter in the greatest detail in the following place, which I will quote again here in full, from World as Will and Idea, Volume 1, page 309. As a result of all this, we can look upon the world of appearance, or nature, and music as two different expressions of the same thing, which itself is thus the only analogy mediating between the two of them. Thus, an understanding of this thing is required in order to have insight into that analogy. Consequently, music, when considered as an expression of the world, is universal to the highest degree, something which even has a relationship with the universality of ideas, rather like the way these are related to particular things. Its universality is, however, in no way the empty universality of abstractions, but something of an entirely different kind, bound up with a thoroughly clear certainty. In this, music is like geometric figures and numbers, which are the universal forms of all possible objects of experience, and applicable to them all, before experience, although they are not abstract, but vivid and always fixed. All possible efforts, excitements, and expressions of the will, all those processes inside human beings which reason subsumes under the broad negative concept of feelings, are there to express through the infinite number of possible melodies, but always in the universality of mere form, without matter, always only according to the thing in itself, not according to its appearance, like its innermost soul without the body. From these inner relationships, which music has with the true essence of all things, we can also account for the fact that when an appropriate music is heard in any scene, business, action, or environment, this music appears to open up to us the most secret sense of these things, and seems to come forward as the most correct and clearest commentary on them. In the same way, for the man who surrenders himself entirely to the experience of a symphony, it appears as if he saw all the possible events of life, and the world drawn over into himself. Nevertheless, he cannot, if he thinks about it, perceive any similarity between that game of sounds and the things which come into his mind. For music is, as mentioned, different from all other arts, in that it is not a portrayal of appearances, or more correctly, the adequate objectification of the will, but the unmediated portrayal of the will itself, as well as the metaphysical complement of all physical things in the world, presenting the thing in itself as complement to all appearances. We could, therefore, call the world the embodiment of music, just as much as the embodiment of the will. And that's why it is understandable that music is capable of bringing out every painting, even every scene of real life and the world, with an immediate and higher significance, and, of course, to do that all the more, the closer the analogy of its melody to the inner spirit of the given phenomenon. On this point we base the fact that we can set a poem to music as a song, or as a vivid presentation in pantomime, or as both in an opera. Such individual pictures of men's lives, given a foundation in the universal speech of time, are not bound to music and do not correspond with music by a compelling necessity, but they stand in relation to music as a random example to a universal idea. They present in the clarity of the real the very thing which music expresses and the universality of mere form. For melodies are, to a certain extent, like general ideas, an abstraction from the real. For reality, the world of separate things, supplies clear phenomena, remarkable in individual things, the single case, to both the universality of ideas and the universality of melodies. Both of these universals, however, are, from a certain point of view, contrary, since ideas consist only of forms abstracted first from perception, rather like the stripped-away outer skin of things, and are thus really and entirely abstractions, whereas music, by contrast, gives the heart of the thing, the innermost core, which comes before all particular shapes. This relationship is easily expressed properly in the language of the scholastics. Ideas are the universals after the fact. Music, however, gives the universals before the fact, and reality, universals in the fact. The fact that in general there can be a connection between a musical composition and a perceptible presentation rests on the point that, as stated, both are only very different expressions of the same inner essence of the world. Now, when a particular case, such a connection is truly present, and the composer has known how to express in the universal language of music the dynamics of the will, which constitutes the core of the event, then the melody of the song, the music of the opera, is full of expression. The composer's discovery of the analogy between both must, however, issue from the immediate realization of the world essence, unknown to his reason, and must not be an imitation, conveyed in ideas with conscious intentionality. Otherwise, the music does not express the inner essence, that is, the will itself, but only imitates inadequately its appearance. Following what Schopenhauer has taught, we also understand music as the language of the unmediated will, and feel our imagination stirred to shape that spirit world which speaks to us invisibly, and nonetheless in such a vital manner, and to embody it in ourselves through a metaphorical illustration. By contrast, image and idea, under the influence of a truly appropriate music, reached an elevated significance. Thus, Dionysian art customarily works in two ways on Apollonian artistic potential. Music arouses us to consider an image, in some way similar to the Dionysian universality, and music then permits that image to come forward with the highest significance. From this intelligible observation, and without any deeper considerations of unapproachable things, I conclude that music is capable of generating myth. That is the most meaningful example, and indeed of giving birth to the tragic myth, that myth which speaks of the recognition of the Dionysian among the Greeks. I have explained the phenomenon of the lyric poet, and after that how music and the lyric poet strives to make known its essence in Apollonian pictures. Let us now imagine that music at its highest intensity also must seek to reach its highest representation. Thus we must consider it possible that music also knows how to find the symbolic expression for its essentially Dionysian wisdom. And where else will we have to look for this expression, if not in tragedy, and in the idea of tragedy generally? From the essence of art, as it is commonly understood according to the single categories of illusion and beauty, it is genuinely impossible to derive the tragic. Only with reference to the spirit of music do we understand a joy in the destruction of the individual. Now, individual examples of such a destruction makes clear the eternal phenomenon of Dionysian art, which brings into expression the will in its omnipotence, out from behind, so to speak, the principle of individuation, the life beyond all appearances, and eternal life, in spite of all destruction. The metaphysical joy in the tragic is a translation of the instinctive unconscious Dionysian wisdom into the language of the image. The hero, the highest manifestation of the will, is destroyed, and we are happy at that, because, after all, he is only an illusion, and the eternal life of the will is not disturbed by his destruction. We believe in eternal life, so tragedy calls out, while the music is the unmediated idea of this life. The work of the plastic artist has an entire purpose. Here Apollo overcomes the suffering of the individual through the bright exaltation in the eternity of the illusion. Here beauty is victorious over the suffering inherent in life. The pain is, in a certain sense, brushed away from the face of nature. In Dionysian art, and in its tragic symbolism, this same nature speaks to us with its true, undisguised voice. Be as I am, under the incessantly changing phenomena, the eternal primordial mother, always forcing things into existence, always satisfied with the changing nature of appearances. This is the end of Part 4 of The Birth of Tragedy by Friedrich Nietzsche. Thank you for listening.